My next guest is going to explain to you what Catholics should know about the faith-based initiative and how it comes out of Catholic social teaching. Please join us. Jim Kelly is the president of the Solidarity Center for Law and Justice in Atlanta, Georgia. And he joins me today to talk about the so-called faith-based initiative that this administration has been trying to put in place now for some time, and it still isn't quite there. Jim Kelly, welcome to the Church and Culture today.
Thank you, Dale.
Why has this idea failed to take root yet in legislation anyway?
Dale, there are two reasons: politics and law. As you would suspect, anything that happens in Washington, D.C. will revolve around those two issues. In this case, you have a culture in our federal government that for decades has insisted that there be an absolute separation between church and state. Those were famous words that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Baptists about forming their church and encouraging them, but reminding them about the proper role of church and state. But that phrase has been too rigorously followed in our national scene, especially when it comes to funding organizations that try to improve people's lives out of Washington, D.C. That's the legal side of it. Fortunately, the Supreme Court is moving away from that absolutist interpretation of our Constitution and is becoming more accommodationist in terms of playing a neutral playing field, and I'll discuss that with you further.
But the essence then of this faith-based initiative is to get government money to religiously affiliated social services so that they can help the needy in different ways on a larger scale with federal monies. Is that correct? And state monies.
That's correct.
Is that the essence?
That's the essence of it, but the essence of it is also for those religious organizations that choose to participate in government-sponsored funding of social services. There are an awful lot of small grassroots organizations that are church-based or community-based that have not had either the technical expertise, the lobbying expertise, any sort of means of cracking that barrier to entry that has existed in federal social service programs. And there has been, over the past decade, a realization on the part of many both Catholic and evangelical grassroots church leaders that they need to have an equal access to these funds.
Now, there is a principle at stake here called subsidiarity.
That's absolutely right, and it's a Catholic principle that has been with us for about a century. And the person who, in my opinion, articulated that in very clear terms as it relates to the church and state was Jacques Maritain, a friend of both of ours.
Philosopher. Yes.
Absolutely. A French Catholic philosopher who engaged his culture of the day. He was as much a philosopher as a theologian, but he practiced integral humanism, saying that we as Christians should come into the society, into the culture, and infuse it with our gospel values. Subsidiarity, in his view, in the view of the Catholic Church, is the principle that things that are best within the purview of the lowest organizations possible should be handled by those organizations, that it should not be the role of the state to usurp those functions because that's really the lifeblood of gospel teaching, is relating to one another at the lowest possible levels, and when the government takes over that function, then we lose really our Christian-infused culture.
So if you have a needy family who needs food, clothes, and shelter, it would be best if a local church with its outreach to the needy be the vehicle for helping that family rather than the state government or the federal government who tried to directly help.
Well, absolutely.
It's going to be more effective.
It's going to be more effective,
Yeah.
and it's going to have more meaning to the community. If you have people who do not have to become engaged in providing those meals because their government's taking care of it for them, then you're going to have a lack of compassion that just will not do in a democratic society or any civil society.
Let me play a devil's advocate. Here you have, say, call it a soup kitchen on a street corner that for years has been funded by donations. and all of a sudden it gets an influx of federal money, say, through the state. Is that going to change the character of that soup kitchen?
I think it will only if the organizers and operators of the soup kitchen let it. First of all, again, this is all voluntary. That soup kitchen does not have to apply for state, local, or federal funds. One of the battles raging right now is, what are going to be the terms of the federal funding of faith-based initiatives? And it's one, as a constitutional lawyer, I'm very interested in, and as a Catholic. I do not want to see our grassroots efforts in the faith-based area diluted because of conditions that come with that funding. I think on the pro side is, why not have two soup kitchens? If they're doing it effectively, why be limited by what you can secure from your donor base?
Or have a bigger soup kitchen.
That's right. Serve more of the people in need. So, and there's a question of fundamental fairness. How the particulars of it, and I'm looking at it from a legal perspective, how the particulars of it, other than the lack of regulation, I'm not too enthused about that. But whether there are 1,000 soup kitchens that come as a result of this legislation, the important thing is that the pluralist principle, that the statement be made that all voluntary associations that are civil in nature should be able to come to the table and receive equal access to government funding, is a very important principle for our democracy.
Yeah, we've talked about what you call the secularization of social services. That it used to be in this country that all social services were the product of these civil associations, whether they were religious in character or not. But somewhere along the line, the government started taking over social services. That's really a new thing in America, isn't it?
It is a new thing, and I think you could look back a little bit to the New Deal era. And then
FDR. My grandfather used to just complain about FDR.
Well, I'm sure there's so much good that came out of that work, but then the Great Society in the 60s added to the question about what was the proper role of the government in terms of taking over these social services that for years had been provided by the Catholic Church and other religious organizations. I think the reason, other than the legal reason I cited earlier about separation of church and state and the overreading of that constitutional provision, I think that the politics of the secularization have been instrumental in where we are today. You have had for the past 40 years politicians from the areas of greatest need in the hardcore urban areas where they need these services. You've had politicians who have been the middlemen and women, and they are the ones who come into the communities and disperse these funds, as if it's their own personal largesse. And only within the last 10 years or so have you started to see religious leaders of a more conservative bent, I should say, in terms of their views about personal responsibility. They now are saying, we want to be able to speak directly to the people in D.C. who are organizing and funding these programs. And that is causing a lot of consternation on the part of politicians who will no longer be dispersing the benefits. If they don't control that purse, then their base is diluted and they're losing control.
Do faith-based social services do a better job than secular ones?
I'm biased, absolutely. In my opinion, I was talking with someone today about the fact that you can go into a program for drug rehabilitation and a person can talk to a psychologist all day long and I'm sure get a lot of good advice. But at some point in time, there's going to have to be a fundamental change in the behavior of that person that will require some spiritual discipline, some inner development that I think can only come through, in our case, the Christian gospel message. So, yes, I do believe that faith-based initiatives will surpass secular initiatives in a lot of those behavior modification programs.
You think that's behind some of the resistance of Congress to get this legislation passed? They simply don't want to give faith-based groups the credit they deserve?
I will not paint Congress with that broad brush. What I will state is that what I've learned over the past 6 years or so since getting involved in some of these issues is that there's an incredible lobbying effort that goes on every day in Washington, D.C., even as to the best well-intentioned social service programs. I'm sure that there are psychologist groups, education groups, other groups who come from the secular perspective that push very hard to keep the religious groups out of that money pot.
Now, Maritain used to always say that we have to use the gospel to leaven the culture. Is this a legitimate way that the gospel can leaven the culture, to be on the receiving end of federal and state money in order to broaden and deepen its work?
I think it absolutely is an important part. When you start talking about the scope of the federal government's involvement, and as it drifts down into the state level, they have usurped so many social service functions and so many programs that need to be infused with gospel values, that if a stand isn't taken so that there is at least the opportunity for equal access, then I think that the traditional religious communities will lose the majority of their platform when it comes to the substantive reaching out to people. As tax rates go up, people will just leave it to the government to do these things. And if you don't have the means to practice your gospel message, or if you're having to compete against monopolies in terms of better funded alternatives, the power of Christ and the power of our church is strong, but I just don't know at what point in time enough is enough, and you've got to take a stand.
Of course, some of the people that oppose this, what's called the CARE legislation, say that, well, what if somebody uses a soup kitchen and then converts to that faith? Then you've got government-subsidized conversion.
Well, as long as that person is not coerced to going to that particular soup kitchen, as long as there's secular alternatives available, then the government can't be accused of using religion as its own device to affect social change.
Of course, you might have a 8th grader go to public school, read Romeo and Juliet, and be led by the example of Friar Lawrence to become a Catholic. Then you've got the same thing.
Where does it end?
Yeah. The example that you cite in Maritain, Maritain was a prophetic philosopher who was part of the founding of UNESCO and the writing of the Declaration of the Rights as enumerated by UNESCO. Do you think that if he were around, he would be supportive of this initiative?
I do. There were several. I've read up on Maritain. I'm not a scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but there are certain things that I've read that have really excited me to see about what prophetic role he did play. And I do have one, if I may.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
I'd like to read. First of all, he was concerned about the role of the state. And if I could, reading from Man in the State. The state is not the supreme incarnation of the idea. The state is not a kind of collective Superman. The state is but an agency entitled to use power and coercion, made up of experts or specialists in public order and welfare, an instrument in the service of man. Jacques Maritain, like the Holy Father, is very concerned about the dignity of the person and the role of the person in a democratic society, and was very concerned, having grown up witnessing the horrors of what could happen when a national estate takes over, about the state overreaching. So I think he would be very excited to know that the faith-based initiatives would be a means of bringing people back to the power base that they need as individual citizens to compete against the state.
Well, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush regarding government social services, but there are so many times that you go into a government office for anything, and you encounter a lack of motivation, a listlessness, a lack of accountability. And of course this varies drastically, and I'm not trying to offend any of our viewers who are employed by governments. But we do know that it's very rare that you go into a volunteer organization where people have given up their time and talent to help people, where you don't face somebody who cares. They wouldn't be there unless they're not being paid to be there.
You're absolutely right, Dale.
Yeah.
We have seen in the marketplace, in the private sector, monopolies don't work. And as soon as a government program to assist people realizes that they're going to get funding no matter what, no matter how effective they are, then the incentive is not there to work as hard as they can.
And that's the key. We want to come back and talk more about that after our break. We're talking about this program called the Faith-Based Initiative, which may well be part of government policy and programs all over the country. We'll be right back. I'm talking with Jim Kelly, the president of the Solidarity Center for Law and Justice in Atlanta, about the faith-based initiative of the President administration. Jim, a lot of people don't realize that in all the branches of the government, in all the departments, there are regulations that, at least up to now, have actually prohibited, say, the Department of Labor, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to get involved with any faith-based social service group.
That's absolutely right. Not only are we fighting a battle on the legislative front, which is stalled at the moment, but there should be some developments within the next few days. The executive branch of the government has tremendous control over who receives what money. And in fact, President Bush, early in his administration, set up 5 centers for faith-based outreach in agencies of the federal government: Education, HUD, HHS, Justice, and Labor departments, set up directors, assistant directors, and staff to comb through those federal regulations to see what barriers to entry there were existing as far as being able to fund faith-based initiatives. Supposing there were even well-intentioned people in our government who thought they were doing a good job at the faith-based level, right, they were handcuffed by regulations. And in fact, a study was released last year that showed that there was an unlevel playing field, that in fact of the billions of dollars of social service aid that flows to organizations, vast majority of it went to secular organizations. And there was very little proof that they were doing a better job than would have been done by faith-based
So we
groups.
really...
He's rolled up his sleeves and is ready to do. He has experience in politics, and he's over at Capitol Hill every day pushing hard for this equal access. So I'm excited. I hope that he will see the wisdom of the Catholic social teaching. I know he understands it. So now it's a good time for us to move forward. I would like to, if I may, read one more quote
Sure.
from Jacques Maritain.
Well, since Maritain is my particular favorite Catholic philosopher, read away.
Okay, this is a favorite quote in helping explain his viewpoint about the need to respect all people who come to the public
Right.
square. Let us conclude first that according to the pluralist principle, everything in the body politic which can be brought about by particular organs or societies inferior in degree to the state and born out of the free initiative of the people should be brought about by those particular organs or societies, the subsidiary principle that we were
Right.
discussing earlier. Then he says that civil legislation should adapt itself to the variety of moral creeds of the diverse spiritual lineages which essentially bear on the common good of the social body, not by endorsing them or approving them, but rather by giving allowance to them.
I mean, letting them do their work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Jacques Maritain was in many ways a prophet of this whole faith-based initiative debate. And to the degree that we understand that, we can realize this isn't some new invention by our current president.
Say the persons who run these social service programs, do you think that when federal, state dollars start flowing in, they'll lose touch with their donor base, the people who have sacrificed to bring them into existence, to sustain them, or they spend all their time filling out bureaucratic forms?
Mr. Hudson, I must say, I will turn the tables on you. As a person who works very hard to develop programs of worth to the Catholic community,
Right.
if you were able to secure a federal grant to do media outreach to people to help them cope better in their lives,
Right.
would you then just ignore your donors,
No.
or would you
No way.
develop that program,
No way.
then take it to your donors
Right.
and say, see what additional
Here,
work
give me
we've been
some
able
more.
to do?
See all this-
Exactly, exactly. You can't play that game with me. So I think it will be an impetus
Right.
for even a broader donor outreach.
Right.
The more charitable groups have programs that are attractive to their donor base, the more they can attract donors. So far from causing them to, ignore them, I think it'll cause them to have further outreach.
And as long as the money doesn't have any strings attached in terms of stripping the denominational theistic character of these organizations, then what's the harm?
In my mind, there is no harm, and let me go back to the Good News Club case, because the dissenters in the Good News case, and there were 3 of them, argued that the Good News youth group should not have access to the public schools because they were trying to have people accept Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. It was a Baptist group. They were trying to, they were singing songs. They were reading from the Bible. And the court said nothing about, well, once you get into that public school classroom, you've got to hire any youth leader that applies. You've got to quit singing the songs. You've got to quit reading the Bible. You've got to quit asking for people to come to the Lord.
Dedication.
Nothing. They just basically said, once you open that door, government, to the provision of access to groups to effect some sort of behavioral change, you've got to give an equal access. And I'm interpreting Good News Club as saying there's no restrictions in terms of having to dilute your religious
So that
message.
decision's good news.
There you go.
And let's hope that as the months pass and the years pass, that this faith-based initiative will be exactly what your vision of it is. And I think it's a vision shared by our president and certainly by those who run that office. So Jim Kelly, thank you for being on the Church and Culture today.
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you. And this is very important that we all know what's going on and pray for it. And hope you'll join me on this show next time.